The
I'm
snow was
afraid
still
the
falling
results
when I
weren't
opened
what we
my
hoped
eyes,
for.
lights blinking through the
The
dark
next
like
steps will
nothing
be
had happened.
difficult, but we're
Christmas
here to
music drifted
support
from a
you.
neighbor's house, cheerful and distant, while I lay there wondering why my body wouldn't move. The last thing I remembered was his hand on my back, and the sound of air leaving my lungs. I had believed our house was safest on holidays, when routines slowed and memories softened everything sharp. Christmas had always meant quiet mornings, warm mugs, and pretending the past couldn't reach us here. But that year, the cold came from inside the walls. What followed wasn't loud or sudden. It unfolded slowly, in silences no one else seemed to notice. The porch lights were still on when I opened my eyes. Not all at once. Just enough to notice the glow resting on the snow, soft and patient, like it had been waiting for me to catch up. The bulbs hummed the way they always did in winter, a low electric comfort that made everything feel held together. Somewhere inside the house, the heater sighed. Pine lingered in the air, real pine, not the candle kind. And for a moment I thought I was still dreaming. Christmas morning had a way of starting quietly for us. No rush. No music yet. Just the house waking on its own schedule. I remember standing in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug that hadn't finished warming, watching steam disappear into the ceiling. He stood across from me, buttoning his sweater, the fabric catching on his cuff. He smiled when he saw me looking, but it didn't reach his eyes. It stopped short, like it always had when something sat between us unspoken. We talked about small things. The weather, the neighbor's lights, whether we'd opened gifts before or after breakfast. Ordinary sentences, placed carefully like ornaments we'd learned not to drop. I noticed he didn't meet my gaze when he spoke. Instead, he watched the clock above the doorway, its second hand clicking too loudly in the quiet. The house listened. I could feel it listening. I don't remember deciding to step outside. It felt more like something I'd always meant to do. The air inside had grown thick, and I needed space. I grabbed the thin sweater from the chair, not the coat hanging by the door, just the sweater, and slipped it on. The porch light flickered as I opened the door, letting cold spill across the threshold. He said my name once softly. Not a warning, just a sound. The cold bit immediately. It found the spaces between my ribs, the soft places at my wrists. Snow crunched under my feet, a sound so familiar it barely registered. I stood there, breathing in the sharpness, watching my breath turn visible and then vanish. The porch rail was dusted white, untouched. The world felt paused, as if the morning were holding its breath too. I heard the door behind me. Not the slam you hear in movies, just the quiet close of wood against frame. I turned halfway. I remember noticing how bright the lights looked against the snow, how everything seemed outlined, clear. His face was shadowed by the doorway, the light behind him flattening his features. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. There was no argument, no raised voices, no words at all. Just a shift, a pressure where there hadn't been one before. The sound came first. A dull thud, not loud, but heavy, like something meant to land. Then wait. The feeling of space opening where solid ground had been. My hands reached for the rail out of habit, muscle memory acting faster than thought. I remember the sweater pulling tight across my shoulders, the cold rushing up to meet me. And then the dark rose quickly, like water. I don't know how long I was gone. Time loosened its grip, stretched thin. When sensation returned, it came in pieces. The sting of cold on my cheek. The taste of metal at the back of my throat. A distant sound, voices, maybe, or wind moving through branches. The lights were still on above me, glowing the same way they always had, as if nothing had interrupted their purpose. I lay there, staring up at the familiar outline of the porch roof, the icicles forming along its edge. They looked delicate, temporary. One of them dripped steadily, the sound marking seconds I couldn't move through. My body felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. When I tried to speak, nothing came out. Just air. I thought about the mug in the kitchen, left cooling on the counter. About the pine needles scattered near the door, tracked in earlier when we brought the tree inside. About how Christmas morning was supposed to feel safe. The cold pressed closer, seeping through the sweater, settling into my bones. Somewhere above me, a step creaked. Or maybe it didn't. It was hard to tell what was real. I focused on the light. The way it spread across the snow, gentle and unhurried. I told myself to stay awake, to keep watching it, to remember how it looked. The house remained quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps rushing down the steps. No voice calling my name again. Just the steady hum of electricity and the soft drip of melting ice. When help finally came, it felt almost accidental. A neighbor awake too early. A door opening. The sound of surprise carried on the cold air. Hands reached for me, careful, unsure. The world tilted as I was lifted, the lights blurring into streaks above. I closed my eyes then, not because I wanted to, but because they were heavy. Later, much later, people would use words like accident. They would talk about slippery steps and early morning cold. They would say Christmas is a dangerous time, that winter makes fools of us all. I would nod because nodding was easier than speaking, because speaking required choosing which parts to carry forward. But even then, lying beneath those lights with snow melting into my hair, I knew something had changed. Something quiet and permanent. The space between inside and outside had widened, and I had fallen into it. As the world moved on above me, I held on to one thought, small and steady as the glow overhead. I was still here, and the lights were still on. The ceiling tiles were the first thing I learned to recognize. Square after square, slightly off-white, each one holding a faint shadow where the lights had warmed them over time. I counted them when I woke. Lost count. Started again. The room breathed in a slow mechanical way, like it had lungs of its own. Somewhere, a monitor tapped out a rhythm that didn't belong to me, but insisted on staying close. I came back in pieces, a sound before a face, a pressure before a name. Voices hovered just beyond clarity, softened as if wrapped in cotton. I heard my name once, spoken gently, like it might bruise if said too firmly. When I tried to answer, my mouth felt unfamiliar. The effort surprised me. Even breathing did. They told me later I asked the same questions over and over. What day is it? Where am I? Did it snow? Each time, someone answered patiently, the way you speak to a child who's had a bad dream. Christmas, they said. You're safe. You had a fall. The words were placed carefully, lined up so nothing sharp could touch me. My body argued with them. Pain arrived without explanation, blooming and retreating in places I hadn't known could ache. My ribs felt like they were remembering something I couldn't yet name. When I shifted, the bed complained softly, metal and plastic reminding me I wasn't home. I closed my eyes and tried to picture the porch lights. The way they looked against the snow. The image slipped away before I could hold it. A doctor leaned close, her voice low and even. She used words like fortunate and recovery and rest. She said accident in the same tone you use for weather, something that happens, something no one controls. I nodded because nodding seemed expected, because it required less effort than forming doubt. He was there when I opened my eyes again. Sitting in the chair by the window, his coat folded neatly over the arm, hands clasped together like he was waiting for instructions. He looked tired in a way that felt practiced. When he saw me watching, he stood too quickly, the chair legs scraping the floor. He smiled, small and careful. You scared me, he said. I tried to answer, but my throat felt tight, like it had learned a new shape. He reached for my hand, his touch light, almost polite. I noticed then how cold his fingers were, even inside the warmed room. He kept his eyes on our hands, not on my face. The nurse came in with a clipboard. Questions followed. Did you feel dizzy? Do you remember slipping? Had you been outside long? Before I could gather my thoughts, he answered for me. His voice was steady, reassuring. He told the story smoothly, like he'd already practiced it somewhere quiet. I listened from the bed, the way you listen to a radio in another room. Parts of it sounded right. The cold, the early hour, the porch steps. But something in me stayed still, refusing to nod along. A pause lived between his sentences, and in that pause, I felt watched by my own silence. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The hospital dimmed its lights, leaving everything washed in blue. Machines continued their soft insistence. Down the hall, someone laughed once, then stopped. I stared at the dark window, trying to see snow through the reflection of my own face. I wondered if the lights were still on at home, if anyone had turned them off. When I closed my eyes, the moment returned, not fully, just enough to unsettle me. A sound without context. The sense of moving when I hadn't meant to. I told myself it was the medication, the shock, the way the mind fills gaps when it's afraid. Still, the memory came back night after night, patient and quiet. He stayed during visiting hours, left when asked. He brought my robe from home, my toothbrush, the book I'd been reading before Christmas. He arranged things on the tray table, as if order itself might help me heal. But he never asked what I remembered. Not once. He talked about insurance forms and weather forecasts, and how the neighbors were worried. Sometimes I caught him watching me when he thought I was asleep. His face went unreadable then, the smile gone, his expression pulled inward. When I opened my eyes, he looked away quickly, as if embarrassed to be seen looking. The doctors continued their gentle explanations. Healing would take time. Bones mend slowly. Memory, they said, can be tricky after a fall. They encouraged rest, patience. They meant well. Their calm felt like a blanket being tucked around my questions. But silence did something different. Silence sharpened things. In the quiet moments, between vitals, between visits, I began to notice what wasn't being said. How the story never changed, even when the questions did. How he avoided certain words, stepping around them as if they were fragile glass. How my own body reacted when I thought about the porch, a tightening just below my ribs, like recognition without language. One afternoon, sunlight found its way through the blinds, striping the wall in pale gold. Dust moved slowly in those lines, unhurried. I watched it and felt something settle inside me. Not certainty. Not yet. Just the understanding that remembering wasn't something to rush. That truth had its own pace. When he came back that evening, he talked about going home, about how quiet the house felt without me. I listened, nodding, my hand resting on the blanket. When he paused, waiting for my response, I said nothing. The silence stretched, thin but unbroken. He shifted in his chair, cleared his throat. Outside, the light faded. The room darkened gently, like a theater between scenes. I lay there, breathing carefully, letting the quiet hold us both. In that space, without words to soften it, something edged closer to the surface. The truth didn't arrive all at once that it didn't need to. It waited. The house smelled like lemon cleaner when I came home. Too clean, like someone had erased fingerprints from every surface. The windows were shut tight, the curtains drawn just enough to keep the light polite. Nothing out of place. Nothing asking questions. Even the clock above the sink ticked softly, as if it knew better than to speak up. He helped me inside with a careful hand at my elbow, guiding me as though I were fragile glass. "Slow," he said, his voice steady. I nodded. The floor beneath my feet felt familiar and strange at the same time, like it had learned something while I was gone. I noticed how the rug had been straightened, the corners tucked in. The house looked prepared. Ready. Friends arrived in the afternoons, carrying warm dishes wrapped in towels. Chicken soup. Baked pasta. Things meant to nourish. They spoke in lowered voices, smiling too quickly. They told me how lucky I was. How grateful they were I was still here. They touched my arm gently, like they were afraid I might disappear again if they pressed too hard. They treated survival like an ending. I thanked them. I always did. Gratitude came easily. It was the other feelings that stayed quiet. When the door closed behind the last visitor and the house settled again, I felt the quiet stretch out, long and deliberate. He busied himself with the dishes, water running longer than necessary. Plates clinked. A ritual. He never asked me what I remembered. Not once. He asked if I was warm enough, if the pain medicine was helping, if I wanted the lamp moved closer. He asked practical questions, the kind that can be answered without opening anything deeper. At night, he lay beside me, careful not to jostle the bed. His breathing stayed even practiced. When I turned toward him, he turned slightly away. The porch remained untouched. Snow melted, then froze again. A thin sheet of ice formed where it had been cleared only enough to make it look cared for. I watched it through the window one morning, my coffee cooling in my hands. The rail cast a faint shadow across the boards, the same shape it always had. No mark. No sign. Just winter doing what winter does. He told the story again one evening when a neighbor stopped by. Slipped. Early morning. Ice you couldn't see. He spoke without looking at me, his eyes fixed on the doorframe. The neighbor nodded sympathetically, shaking her head at the cruelty of cold weather. When she left, he exhaled, long and slow, like he'd been holding something in. That night, I lay awake listening to the house. It made sounds I didn't remember, soft creaks, a settling I hadn't noticed before. I replayed his words in my head, lining them up with what I felt in my body. The timing didn't quite match. The way he said he'd heard me fall. The way he said he found me. The way he never said where he was standing when it happened. I didn't accuse that I didn't ask. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed how his answers shifted depending on who was listening. A minute earlier here. A step closer there. Small changes, easy to miss if you weren't already listening closely. When I asked him casually what time it was when I stepped outside, he paused. Just a beat too long. Then answered. Early, he said. Before sunrise. I nodded. Let it pass. But later, alone, I remembered the clock on the stove. The way the numbers had glowed blue when I glanced at them. I remembered thinking there was still time before daylight. The memory didn't shout. It didn't need to. It just stayed. He avoided the porch altogether. Took the long way around the house, even when it meant stepping through snow. When I asked if he could grab something from outside, he offered to do it later. When I said I might sit out there for a moment, he suggested the sunroom instead. He smiled when he said it. Not with his eyes. One afternoon, I went out there alone. I moved slowly, my body reminding me with each step that it was still healing. The door creaked the way it always had. Cold air slipped inside, familiar and sharp. I stood just inside the frame at first, then stepped out fully. The boards were firm beneath my feet, the rail cold to the touch. I wrapped my fingers around it and closed my eyes. Nothing happened. Of course it didn't. But my chest tightened anyway, like it recognized the space. I stood there until my breath steadied, until the quiet stopped pressing so close. When I went back inside, he was waiting in the kitchen, hands resting on the counter. He looked at my face, then quickly away. "You shouldn't be out there alone," he said. I watched him then. Really watched. The way his jaw tightened. The way his foot shifted slightly, like he was bracing for something. I realized in that moment what he was afraid of. Not the porch. Not the ice. Me. What I might remember. That night, as we lay in the dark, I felt the distance between us widen. Not loud. Not sudden. Just enough to notice. I turned onto my side, facing the window, watching moonlight trace the edges of the room. He didn't reach for me. Didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't ask anything that might invite an answer he couldn't control. The house settled again, deeper this time, like it was keeping a secret. I listened to it breathe. To him breathe. In the quiet, pieces began to align. Not into a story yet, but into a shape. A feeling with edges. I understood then that silence can be a question. And sometimes it's the only one worth answering. Outside, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting its familiar glow across the snow. I watched it from the window, steady and unchanged. The truth felt close then. Close enough to reach. But I stayed where I was, letting it wait. It had time. The chair scraped across the kitchen floor, and my hands went still. It wasn't loud. Just wood against tile. A sound I'd heard 1,000 times before. But this time it carried weight. My breath caught, sharp and quick, like my body had recognized something my mind hadn't finished naming yet. I stood there, fingers wrapped around the edge of the counter, waiting for the feeling to pass. It didn't. Memory didn't come back all at once. It arrived sideways, through ordinary moments that refused to stay ordinary. The smell of cold air when the door opened. The way my shoulders tensed when someone stood too close behind me. A hand placed a little too firmly at my back as I stepped aside in a grocery aisle. Each time, my body reacted first. The knowing came later. I began keeping a notebook. Nothing dramatic. Just a small spiral-bound one I'd found in the drawer beside the fridge. I didn't write accusations. I didn't write conclusions. I wrote what I noticed. Times. Sounds. The way certain memories made my chest tighten, while others slid away untouched. I wrote in the mornings when the house was quiet, the pen scratching softly, the heater ticking awake. The pages filled slowly. A sentence here. A question there. I wrote about the porch. How the rail felt colder than I expected when I touched it again. How my feet remembered where to stand before my mind did. I wrote about the way he avoided that space, how he watched me carefully whenever I drifted too close to the door. I didn't show him the notebook. I didn't tell him it existed. One afternoon, when the light was thin and gray, I went outside alone. The snow had melted down to patches, revealing dark wood beneath. I stood where I thought I had stood that morning. I turned just slightly, imagining the angle of the house behind me. I traced the rail with my fingers until it ended, the smoothness stopping abruptly where air began. I closed my eyes, and there it was. Not a blur, not a guess. The sensation returned with precision. The pressure. The imbalance. The moment my body tipped before my thoughts could follow. It wasn't violent in the way people expect violence to be. It was controlled. Deliberate. The memory settled into place like a piece clicking into its correct spot. Inside, the house remained quiet. I could hear the clock ticking through the wall, steady and indifferent. I opened my eyes and stepped back, my heart steady now, my breath even. I understood something then. The truth didn't need volume. It needed clarity. Conversations from years ago surfaced differently after that. Things people had said that I'd brushed aside, smiling politely, choosing peace over discomfort. A friend who'd once asked if I was okay, really okay. A sister who'd warned me, gently, about the way he spoke when he thought no one was listening. I'd dismissed them all, certain I knew my own life better than anyone else. Now those words returned heavier, not accusatory, just present. He noticed the change in me before I said anything. The way I watched more than I spoke. The way I paused before answering questions. He asked if I was tired. If the pain was acting up again. I nodded when it was easier than explaining. He smiled, but not with his eyes. At night, I wrote more. The notebook grew thicker with quiet details. Dates. Small inconsistencies. The way his story shifted depending on the listener. I didn't rush. I let certainty arrive on its own time. And when it did, it was unmistakable. The truth no longer felt like something floating just out of reach. It had edges. A shape. I remembered the sound of the door closing behind me. Not hurried. Not slammed. Just closed. I remembered the absence of words. The lack of surprise. The way his breath hadn't changed before my footing did. These were not things fear invented. They were things memory returned when it felt safe enough to speak. One evening, he stood in the doorway of the living room, watching me write. The lamp cast a soft circle of light over the table, leaving his face partly in shadow. He asked what I was working on. I told him it was just notes. My voice stayed calm. He nodded, but didn't move closer. About the fall, he asked. I looked up then. Met his eyes fully. The room felt very still. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, thin and deliberate. He shifted his weight, glanced away. Just things I don't want to forget, I said. He didn't push, didn't ask more. That told me everything I needed to know. Later, alone again, I stood by the window and watched the porch light come on automatically as dusk settled. The glow spread across the boards, familiar and steady. I felt no fear this time. Just resolve, quiet and firm. When memory settles into certainty, something else follows. Not anger. Not shouting. A decision. I closed the notebook and rested my hand on its cover, feeling the slight bend of the pages beneath my palm. Outside, the cold air pressed against the glass, patient as ever. I wasn't ready to speak yet, but I was ready to be heard. The truth had finished returning, and it wasn't going anywhere. The kettle hadn't whistled yet, but I could already feel the morning listening. Light gathered slowly along the edge of the counter, pale and careful, as if it didn't want to disturb anything. I stood there with my hands resting on the sink, feeling the cool porcelain beneath my palms, letting the house wake on its own terms. Outside, the porch light clicked off automatically, daylight taking over without ceremony. I had chosen this morning because it felt honest. No rush. No one watching. I carried the notebook with me, its corners soft from use. It weighed more than paper should. When I opened it, the pages fell naturally to where I'd stopped the night before. Dates. Observations. Small truths written down so they wouldn't drift away again. I didn't rehearse what I would say. I trusted the words to come when they were needed. The office smelled like old books and lemon polish. The chair across from me creaked when I sat, the sound steadying my breath. The woman who listened didn't interrupt. She didn't lean forward dramatically or soften her voice too much. She just waited. That mattered more than anything. I spoke slowly, I spoke plainly. I told her about Christmas morning, about the light and the cold and the quiet that followed me outside. I told her where I stood, where he stood, where the rail ended. I didn't use metaphors. I didn't protect anyone's feelings. I named what happened with the same care I'd used to write it down. There was relief in that, not loud relief. A loosening. When I finished, the room stayed still. The silence felt different this time. No longer heavy, no longer threatening. Just space. She nodded once, like she had been waiting for the last piece to settle. She thanked me for being clear, for trusting myself. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, feeling the steady beat beneath it. When I got home, he was in the living room, folding a blanket that didn't need folding. He looked up when I entered, his smile already in place. It faltered when he saw my face. I didn't sit down. I didn't take my coat off. I stood where the light from the window reached both of us evenly. I told them, I said. He didn't ask who. Didn't ask what. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His silence changed shape right there. It stopped being careful. It became exposed. The kind of quiet that is nowhere left to hide. I watched it settle over him, watched the color drain from his face as if the room had grown colder. I remember. I said, gently did I let the words rest between us. He looked at the floor. At the wall. At anything but me. The house made a small sound, a shift in the pipes, like it was acknowledging something. I felt no urge to raise my voice. No desire to press. The truth didn't need force anymore. It had learned how to stand on its own. He tried to say my name. It came out thin. I shook my head, not in anger, just in finality. There were no speeches left to give. No explanations I wanted to hear. I walked past him, my steps steady, and went to the bedroom to pack a bag I had already chosen in my mind. Later, when the house was empty again, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the quiet. It wasn't the same quiet as before. This one didn't press down. It didn't ask me to forget. It felt earned. I ran my fingers over the quilt my grandmother had made years ago, the stitches uneven but strong. I thought about how many hands had held it before mine. Being believed did something unexpected. .it didn't make me feel powerful. .it made me feel light. The days that followed moved slowly, deliberately. I answered questions. I repeated myself when needed. Each time, it felt easier, like a path being cleared by steady footsteps. I slept with the window cracked open, letting cold air remind me where I was. The porch light still came on at dusk, a small constant in a changing world. One evening, I stood outside again. Not to test myself, just to stand. The boards were cool beneath my feet, the rail solid in my hands. I breathed in the night, letting it fill me without taking anything away. Somewhere down the street, a radio played softly. Life unbothered, continuing. I thought about survival then, how it isn't just about staying alive, it's about staying present. Survival is choosing clarity over comfort. It's naming what happened even when your voice shakes. It's understanding that release doesn't always look like justice on display. Sometimes it looks like a quiet room, a steady breath, a truth spoken plainly and received without question. I turned off the porch light myself that night. The switch clicked softly, final and unremarkable. Inside, the house held the darkness easily. I set the notebook on the table and didn't open it. I didn't need to. As I lay down, the world felt wide again. Not dangerous, just open. I closed my eyes, feeling the day settle into memory without resistance. Tomorrow would bring its own work, its own listening. For now, it was enough to know this. I told the truth, and it stayed told.